develop weapons that are so terrifying as to make the thought of global war almost a sentence for suicide, you would think that man's intelligence would include also his ability to find a peaceful solution. And in the words of another American, Martin Luther King, the chain reaction of evil, hate, begetting hate, wars produce more wars, must be broken, or we should be plunged into the dark days of annihilation. I believe we can find those solutions. We can walk the hard yards to a better way to live together on this planet. A Labour government will give leadership in a new and constructive way, and that is the leadership we're ready to provide, both at home and abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. Before going to the floor and first of all to our membership, I have the prerogative to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
So first of all, when you're in the UN and as a permanent member of the Security Council, to make things work, you need to have agreement with all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they are protecting others. So you need to do deals across the board, and often with countries with very poor human rights records, in order to achieve what you want to achieve. So how does that square with a foreign policy that's based on human rights, that's based on an ethical approach? How do you manage to square the method and the end results?
You have to measure your policy against the human rights records that we want and the obligations that all 5 of the permanent members of the Security Council have signed up to through the Universal Declaration and through the International Criminal Court, which is not universal, but we wished it were, and the other conventions such as rights of the child, rights of women, and rights of environmental survival. I think you have to engage with all those countries on it. And indeed, there is evidence that where you do engage, things begin to change. I mean, the engagement with China on environmental issues has changed Chinese attitudes quite a lot, and also I suspect the high levels of pollution in Chinese cities has probably changed attitudes quite a lot. It is a question of being prepared to engage. It's not always lecturing people, it's learning from them as well. But it's also recognizing that we can't go on as a planet just presiding over this grotesque levels of inequality and accepting that there are tens of millions of displaced people and refugees trying to survive, often in the poorest countries in the world. The numbers who come to Europe by comparison to the rest of the world are actually quite small, but the disaster often affects the poorest in the poorest countries in the world. Think what it's like to be festering in a refugee camp in Libya or other places, just trying to survive. So the 5 members, five permanent members of the Security Council do have a special responsibility in this, and you do have to engage with them. And so I would want to engage with Russia on human rights issues just as much as I would with China or any other country.
Thanks. And then, as you know, people have come to expect and welcome your letters from citizens to Prime Minister's questions. So we thought we'd take a leaf out of your book.
Okay.
And
which citizen has written to us?
So it's Pauletta from Cheltenham, and she's addressing something that you haven't talked about. And she said, "Dear Patricia, please could you ask Mr. Corbyn what he would do to increase cybersecurity in the UK, and at the same time making sure that we keep our privacy online and are defended from attackers?"
Cybersecurity is a very good question. It's actually probably the greatest threat that's faced all around the world at the present time, because cyber attacks can disable transport systems, disable communications, disable media, interfere apparently in elections in some countries. There's lots of things. I'm making no suggestions about anything in this country. It's okay. Put your pens down quickly. But it's a very good question, and it is a very serious one. And so you have to ensure that we've got the capability to deal with cyber attacks against our crucial infrastructure, our crucial infrastructure, which is, of course, telephone, mobile phones, and all the other things. But there is also the question of surveillance. And indeed, we have challenged the government on this over the question of the right of universal intrusion into people's emails, which I think is to be totally wrong. As a member of the Justice Select Committee, we had these discussions with the European Union during many delegations and visits we had there, and we did put forward appropriate amendments to recent legislation in the House so that we protect the privacy of the individual, but recognise that cyber attacks are real and extremely dangerous. Listen, we live in a very high-tech, complicated world where if you interfere with security systems surrounding power supplies or anything else, then you actually endanger life very, very quickly. You can kill people very quickly without firing any kind of gun or anything else. This is the challenge of our time, and I think it's time that we all faced up to it. Very good question. Thank you, Paulette.
Great, thank you. That's
I'll catch you, Pauletta.
Of Cheltenham.
Of Cheltenham. I'll catch
I'm
you.
sure that address is significant.
Well, I wasn't going to make any reference to, but you have indelicately made one.
Okay, so I'm now going to our membership, and I'm looking for people at the back primarily who are young and of any gender they wish to be. So can I encourage people to... Yes, you get your turn, don't worry.
So you're looking for only young members get to ask a question, is that what you're saying?
Yes, not quite. I just want to start off the questioning perhaps with the voice from the future. So... Is there anyone? No? Xenia, I'm going to call on you as our next first speaker.
Thank you very much. My name is Xenia Wickett. I run the US and the Americas program here at Chatham House. You've laid out a platform that is almost the antithesis of the platform that's been laid out by Donald Trump. You've expressed that there would be no intention of hand-holding the Americans or the American president. But you also have to recognize there are huge links between the United States and the United Kingdom. Economic links, intelligence links. How are you going to pass those two things? On the one hand, very publicly saying that I fundamentally disagree with many of the positions taken by this administration, but on the other hand, trying to ensure that there's the economic engagement, the investment engagement, the intelligence engagement continues.
Wait, I'm going to take two more questions before. So if I can go to this gentleman here in the white shirt in the sort of third row back. Wait for the microphone. And can you say who you are when you introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hello, my name's Max Nicholson. I'm a postgraduate student at King's College. What future would the intelligence community in the UK have under a Labour government? And also, would you seek to make changes to the Investigatory Powers Act?
Thank you. And then the gentleman here behind you. Thanks.
Thank you. Sean Curtin, member of Chatham House. On the hand-holding point, you said no more hand-holding with Donald Trump, but I don't see that there's anything wrong with two men in this day and age holding hands in public. And listening to your speech, I think that actually there are many points that you and Trump have in common. You both described the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a catastrophe, and your commitment to the renewal of Trident and to spending at least 2% of GDP on defence will, I presume, get Trump to want to hold your hand. But my question is, the one area which you really seem to focus on in your speech was North Korea. And you seem to be very critical of Trump's approach. So I'd like you to just flesh out what is your approach to the North Korean problem. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for those questions. The approach to, on the first question, was it US and sorry, was
the US trade.
I can't read my own writing, that's the problem. Well, quite clearly, we have a very close relationship with the United States. We have a cultural relationship, we have a trade relationship, and we had, ever since the First World War, a military relationship with the United States. Does that mean that we always agree with every US president? No, not at all. The British government at the time, whilst politically supportive of the Americans in Vietnam, didn't commit British troops to it, and therefore one would suggest there was some degree of criticism implicit in that. Does it mean you can't have a relationship with them? No, I think it's the opposite. I think you have a relationship and you might say it's critical, but it's also not just with the US president. I mean, there's day-to-day relationships with members of the House and members of the Senate, as well as all the other different communities across the USA. And so I have been in the USA many times, met huge numbers of people of diverse political opinions. You work with them all, but the relationship with the USA is an important one, and obviously something we would want to maintain. On the question about Investigatory Powers Act and intelligence community, yes, we would obviously maintain GCHQ, and we would ensure that the powers of investigation into the citizen are backed up by a legal process. We would not give unaccountable power of investigation into somebody's life. And so if the authorities want to investigate streams of emails, whatever else, they have to get a legal backing and able to do it. We don't want to create a surveillance society where there is untrammeled power of interference in the lives of the individual or of their privacy. Thanks for your point about hand-holding. Obviously, a Labour government would meet with President Trump and would have discussions with him. And you raised the point about North Korea. Well, I am very clear that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is important and must be made to work, but there are a number of nuclear-armed countries that don't have membership of the NPT, North Korea being one of them. The six-party talks were making a great deal of progress. The only way forward in the crisis over relations between the United States and Korea has to be a resumption of the six-party talks, has to be encouraging and thanking China for what it's done so far in trying to diffuse tensions, and also working with the South Korean government at the same time. Because the idea that one would countenance the bombing of the people of North Korea or of North Korea sending missiles that would kill others is absolutely appalling. So there has to be a development relationship. Now, the Obama administration seemed to be moving in the direction of building closer relations and trying to develop some sort of dialogue with North Korea. I think that is a wholly good idea, and we should encourage that, and that is what I would encourage that we do. One advantage Britain has is that we have a tradition of assuming diplomatic relations with countries that have an effective government. That means we do have relations, and I think it's important that we develop that principle.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions here, please.
Mr. Corbyn, John Pienaar, BBC News. What do you say to voters who support the British nuclear deterrent when you've made clear you would never order its use, either first or in retaliation? You have made that clear, haven't you? And what do you say to supporters of British military power when it's not clear in what circumstances you would ever order forces into battle, in or out of NATO, and including strikes against Islamic State?
And if I could then pass the piece to the Minister. Thank you.
Morning, Jeremy. Rachel Younger from ITV News. You say military action in some circumstances is necessary. You opposed it in both Kosovo and Sierra Leone. In retrospect, were those interventions the right thing to do? And in 4 weeks' time, you could be not just Prime Minister, but also de facto Commander-in-Chief. When you think about the enormity of the office, is that the part of the job that scares you most?
Thanks. And then last question from over here.
You mentioned the problem of the vetoes. How else would you seek legitimacy for action, and what's your attitude to responsibility to protect in a humanitarian crisis?
Thanks. John, the question about our security is obviously paramount. I've made that very clear. Emily's made that clear in her statements, as has Nia and others. Clearly, the importance is to protect people, all of our people, to make sure they're not under any kind of threat. Does that mean that there are ultimately some circumstances where you use military force? Yes, there are. And you think back to our history. many in this room, well, nobody in this room was around at the time of the First World War, but I'm sure many would have questioned its legitimacy and its whole approach. I doubt many, if any, in this room would have questioned the legitimacy ultimately of the Second World War because of the catastrophe that had approached by the rise of the Nazis all across Europe at that point. And so I think there has to be ultimately that preparedness to use military force. Now, the question that was raised also, in continuing your theme, concerning, for example, Kosovo and Sierra Leone, the situation in Kosovo is not good. Could it have been dealt with in a different way? And could there have been a different approach? Yes, I believe there could. On Sierra Leone, there was actually quite wide agreement on the principles behind it, but there has to be a follow-up as well, and the follow-up has to be the kind of support and nation building you give at the end. And there have been places I've been to where there has been a UN-backed military action in order to bring about or ensure a ceasefire, and continue development of that country. I was, for example, a UN observer at the East Timor referendum, which had come at the end of an appalling civil war that had gone on for decades, with tens of thousands of people lost their lives, and that military UN intervention to enforce the ceasefire by and large worked. And I think you have to be aware that there are cases where you can do that, but it has to be done on a basis of law, and it has to be done through the United Nations. On the question of vetoes and responsibility to protect, I'm interested in the responsibility to protect issue and argument. Again, I think it has to be backed up by international law and backed up via the United Nations. I have also been in Rwanda and Burundi and the DRC, and the war in the DRC has claimed probably more lives than any other conflict that has happened since the Second World War. It has not had the attention of the world's media. It has not had the concentration of the world's media, and the killing has gone on. Rape has become an instrument of war in the DRC. And indeed, I've been in Goma meeting hundreds of women who were collective victims of rape, and it was the most traumatic and educative experience of my life just to talk to them. Could something have been done? Yes. Could we have done more to promote a ceasefire? Yes. Could we have done more to challenge blood diamonds, coltan, and all the other things that are brought out of DRC? Yes. Why didn't we? Many, many questions I ask, one of which is the economic interests of people that didn't want us to intervene because they were getting the wealth out of there. Could something have been done to intervene at the time of the genocide in Rwanda? Yes, I believe it could. And indeed, I've met people in both Rwanda and Burundi who feel very bitter to this day that more was not done. And again, there seems to be an assumption that a war in Africa is somehow or other different to something on the edges of Europe. And so I think we have to engage. We also have to engage positively afterwards, because if you think of nations that have come out of conflict, take Colombia, take El Salvador. Colombia, decades and decades of civil war. Eventually, by good action by neighbouring countries, ceasefire was produced and a peace process has developed. But if you don't stay the course afterwards, as happened in El Salvador, those that were formerly protagonists in a civil war then end up in criminal gangs, and you have a similar degree of killing and instability, this time for crime rather than the purposes of engagement in that civil war. So it is about engagement, but it's also about use of the UN and international law. My question mark is over unilateral action.
Sorry, I know that was a really long list of questions, Mr. Corbyn, but would you mind asking the second part of mine, which is whether being our de facto commander-in-chief would be the part of being Prime Minister that scares you most?
Not at all.
So just for those who couldn't hear because it wasn't on the microphone.
Sorry, the question was about whether I found that part of the job the most frightening. Not at all. I want to see a peaceful world. I've spent my life wanting to see a peaceful world. I've spent my life working for the human rights of all. and ensuring that everybody has some chance in life. If you don't mind, one slight anecdote. I met a group of refugees in a refugee camp in Syria before the present conflict broke out. And these were people living in tents on the border of Iraq and Syria in appalling, appalling conditions. They deserved better. And I was talking to this 14-year-old girl and her family, one of whom had died because the tents had burnt down. I said, what do you want to achieve in your life? And this child, in a tent, in the middle of misery and everything else, she said, thank you for your question. I want to be a doctor. Wow. She had ambitions. You see those all over the world. And so the opportunity of leading a government that will help to promote international law, will address issues of global imbalance and insecurity, and will be realistic about terrorist threats, realistic about threats of cyber insecurity, is something I relish. Because our task surely has to be to leave the world better and more peaceful for the next generation, rather than more dangerous and more at war the next generation. You have to deal with the problems all over. You have to deal with them in an international, multilateral way.
Jeremy, you're very popular. Everyone wants to ask you a question, and John wants a... Is it a
John
clarification?
John sees me almost every... John Pienaar sees me almost every day.
Mr. Corbyn.
And you're causing upsets with Sky now.
Mr. Corbyn.
John, you're starting trouble with your mates.
John, in that case, I'm going to go to...
Briefly, for the sake of clarification, if I may.
Can we get on, please?
For the sake of Mr. Corbyn, you mentioned the importance...
John, can we move on, please?
All right,
it's unfair on the rest of the audience.
There's a lady in the front, in the third row back in the red jacket. Always wear red if you want to be noticed.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
That seems to be a trick that works. Yeah, my name is Dorothy Guerrero. I'm head of policy and advocacy from Global Justice Now. My question are two, actually. One is on climate. Considering that the policy of President Trump seems to be bent on making it more difficult for the even minimum agreements in the Paris COP impossible, what will be your position on that? Second is on the South China Sea. Considering the golden age of relationship with China and the historical relationship with the U.S., what will be the difference in the UK policy on South China Sea?
I knew you'd ask good questions. At the back, please. Thank you.
Very much. Saad Al-Douri, I'm a researcher with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. You mentioned the need to have human rights at the heart of UK foreign policy, and you also mentioned the need to work towards and support a peaceful peace agreement in Syria. But we know that the Assad regime in Syria has systematically persecuted its population and conducted human rights abuses on a mass scale. So could I ask you to clarify your position on the future of an Assad regime in Syria?
Okay, and then the last question here from...
Mr. Corbyn, Jason Powell, Sky News. If you become Prime Minister next month, will you immediately withdraw the RAF from sorties in Syria and Iraq? And if it's better to talk rather than bomb, what would you say to ISIS?
Okay. First of all, on the point asked about climate change, I more than regret the language President Trump used during his election campaign about the global threats of climate change and environmental degradation around the world. And I did indeed attend the Paris conference on climate change for a short time myself. And we have to be totally realistic that unless we are to take even more serious action than we do now on emissions, on pollution, and on environmental degradation, then obviously lots of life on the planet is under threat. We already have conflicts and wars based on environmental disasters. We have to be prepared to do far more to sustain our natural world and our environment. The refugees from Darfur have got involved in the conflict. In fact, they're basically environmental refugees, and there are many, many other examples around the world. And so we would adhere absolutely to it. And indeed, the last Labour government was very strong in supporting all the international conventions, both on pollution as well as on CO2 emissions and the effects of global warming. And so I would be very strong on those issues, and indeed have been involved in many campaigns on those for a very long time. We can't go on polluting our seas, because in the end we pollute ourselves if we carry on doing that. The issue about the South China Sea, yes, there are obviously problems with China's behaviour. There has to be pressure put on them. There has to be an agreement reached. You cannot just say, because it's China, you can't say anything to them. You have to do something about it. China wants to be part of the world community. We all want everybody to be part of the world community. Therefore, that means putting UN pressure on them over their activities in the South China Sea. On the question that was raised at the back about human rights as a central foreign policy, of course it is. And I absolutely agree with you. The Assad regime has committed the most appalling human rights abuses, as have other forces within the region. There has to be a political process. That political process must also involve Iran. Geneva I didn't work because Iran wasn't involved. Geneva II, or if it now to be Geneva III, must involve all the actors within the region, including Iran. And I find it more than regrettable that President Trump now seems to be trying to tear up the agreement that was that President Obama's government and others had so painstakingly negotiated with Iran, which also had with it the possibilities of improving human rights in Iran by a human rights negotiation process, and that's got to be always got to be important. On what we'll do over RAF presence and sorties, we'll examine what they're doing straight away, examine what their presence is straight away, but above all, that fits in to the whole point I'm saying, that I would do everything I possibly could in order to reignite the peace process, to ensure that there is a Geneva III dealing with the conflict in Syria, and clearly isolating ISIS is very important. Their arms and their money don't come from nowhere. They are being supported by a lot of people who are pouring money and arms into them. And so those people that are being, whose lives are being destroyed by ISIS and its behaviour, need to also be recognised that the people that in effect are killing them are those that are giving money, arms, and allowing them to sell oil, which funds the whole ISIS. There has to be a comprehensive political and economic approach to the conflict.
Would you look at introducing a new financial tracking approach then, in the way that the United States has
A much stronger financial tracking approach is very, very important, because if you don't do that, you don't know where the money's coming from, where it's going to, and the amounts of money floating around the world that have come from international drug dealers and others, not so much in Syria but in other parts of the world, again, there has to be financial tracking, and our approach to that would be we'd have a very vigorous, rigorous financial tracking mechanism.
Okay, thank you.
No. I've made that clear that no, I would want to bring about a political solution, which would be through the Geneva process.
There's a woman in the green shirt, please.
A woman in the green shirt. Hi.
Hello, thank you. Deborah Haynes from The Times. You talk about how you would support the Trident system. Does that mean that you as Prime Minister would back a like-for-like replacement of the 4 submarines?
Well,
and also, could I ask a second question?
Sorry, go on, yeah.
Which conflict that has had British troops deployed to since the end of the Second World War have you actually supported, please?
Okay, I'll go on now to the woman in the back there with the hand up. Thank you.
I'm Margaret Owen, a peace in Kurdistan. Jeremy, you're a great friend of the Kurds, and they're grateful to you. What will be the Labour government's policy towards Turkey? Will it condemn the genocide that is going on against the Kurds in Syria and in Turkey? Will it do anything to renew the peace process, ensure the Kurds are represented at the Geneva thing? And will you actually review the arms sales and actually review arms sales to countries which violate human rights? Will you condemn that Turkey for this. Thank you.
And then, gentleman over here on the left, please. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Euripides. I'm High Commissioner of Cyprus. Thank you for the tour d'horizon. A few words on Brexit, please, in relation to defense and foreign policy. Thank you.
And then in the white shirt. Is it white? Can't see. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Corbyn. I delivered a letter on Wednesday to the Prime Minister. I'm a former Royal Marine, and we are concerned about the cuts to defence since 2010. Freedom isn't free, and I know there's been conflicts that we've got into that haven't necessarily been successful in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the security of our liberal democracy depends on a strong defence. Will you therefore guarantee you will fully fund the Defence SDSR 2015, and you will increase defence spending from the cuts that have happened from 2010 and undermined our ability to preserve our freedom in the future?
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. On deployment of British troops, yes, there are deployments, largely through the United Nations, that I think are the right thing to do. I mentioned what went on in East Timor. There's been great help done in peacekeeping in Cyprus by British forces. There's also been, I think, incredible work done by Royal Marines and others in helping refugees to survive who've been at risk in the Mediterranean. And indeed, talking to people in the Royal Navy about this, some of them said to me it was the most amazing work they'd ever done in their lives, which was actually supporting and protecting life. On the question that Margaret raised about Kurdistan, the Kurdish people were denied their identity by the conclusion of the Treaty of Versailles, and they're still living with the consequences of that. An independent Kurdistan was originally recognised in the Woodrow Wilson 14 points and then obliterated a few years later. And there's that thirst for that identity of the Kurdish people. Indeed, there are many Kurdish people in my constituency, and I've visited at various times in my life all parts of Kurdistan and have witnessed the way in which Kurdish people have been very, very badly treated, and that indeed has then provoked the backlash of war there. And I would be very strong with the Turkish government on its treatment of Kurdish people and minorities and the way in which it's denied them their decency and human rights, and use all the legal powers we have on that. And also, if arms are being used to oppress people internally in violation of international law, then they should simply not be supplied to them. And any settlement in Syria and the Middle East must include recognition of the rights and needs of Kurdish people, Armenians, and others. Because if you suppress somebody's identity, which is what's happened with the Kurdish people, then you actually end up with the danger of a much greater conflict later on. It is a question about recognizing people's language and their identity, which is, I think, an important part towards peace. The point our friend raised from the Cyprus High Commission, nice to see you here. 2 points I make. First, that I support reunification of Cyprus and the talks to bring that about, and Britain has a special role in this because it's a guarantor of the 1960 independence of Cyprus, and you and I have discussed this on a number of occasions, and we would certainly be very, very active in bringing that about. Emily and I indeed have discussed that with you. On foreign policy, on Brexit, yes, we will want to work with people. We will obviously still be members of the Council of Europe. We will obviously still be part of the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I see as a very, very important instrument of promoting peace and security all across Europe. And the point our friend raised from the Royal Marines, you probably noticed it in my own speech. I made a point about the way in which members of the armed forces have often had pay frozen. Those that are leaving the armed forces do not get, in my view, the support they need on leaving the armed forces, and too many of our former soldiers end up in a very, very difficult situation indeed. So I would look very quickly at the welfare issues surrounding our armed forces, but also your point about the funding of your group, the Royal Marines, and others, is a very important one, because actually it's that capability of defending is the most important, and I would recognise that and support that. When you said you delivered a letter, I thought you were going to say you delivered a letter to me, and I couldn't remember whether I'd seen it or not. Give me if I can have a copy, I'd be most grateful. Thank you.
Like for like.
Well, the decision of Parliament was to endorse the government's proposal for the replacement of Trident. That is the decision we will inherit as a Labour government, and that is what the position is. We will also undertake a strategic defence review, as all incoming governments do, looking at all aspects of our defence priorities for the future. But we cannot obviously decide what a review would decide, otherwise you wouldn't have a review.
Listen, I'm really sorry, but we have to end it here. And I know everyone's got far more questions, and I think that's a measure of the success of the event. I'd like to thank you, Jeremy, for making Chatham House the venue where you made your foreign policy and defence speech. Thank you for being so forthcoming. Thank you for answering as many questions as you possibly could.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.